So I'll say good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Biodiversity in the Built Environment, a special event from Constructive Voices, the first of several special events that we will be hosting this year, and this event, the highlight of our Biodiversity Month. So thanks for joining us, and a big thank you to all of you who are on our panel, but also the many people who are joining us as part of the audience as well. Please, can I ask you to remain on mute unless you're asked to speak? In a moment, we'll meet our amazing panel of experts, but first I'm going to bring in a voice that if you're a regular listener to the Constructive Voices podcast, then you'll know his voice. Or, of course, if you're based in Ireland or have ever watched Ireland's biggest shows on construction, Pete the Builder, Peter Finn, TV Builder, part of Constructive Voices, my co-host on the podcast. And Pete, good to see you.
Hey Steve, how's it going? Thank you very much for a very colourful introduction there. I really appreciate it. Just a very quick thing, guys. I just want to welcome everybody to our round table, and just let you all know that we're honoured and we're proud to have our platform being used for such an important meeting, and absolutely keep an eye out on more events that we're going to have throughout the year. So that's me. Very welcome to everybody, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it.
Excellent. Good to see you, Pete, as always. Lots of people joining, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for being part of this special event. Now, Claire Wansbury is the expert on this. I'm here to keep everything flowing and to move things along and make sure that we keep as much to time as we possibly can. But Claire is the absolute expert on what we're talking about this afternoon, biodiversity. Claire, welcome, and perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience, please.
Thank you. Hi, yes, I'm Claire Wansbury. I'm Atkins Fellow and Technical Director at Atkins, which is a large engineering and environmental consultancy, part of the SNC Lavalin Global Group. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to Constructive Voices for dedicating this time to biodiversity. So, Steve, shall I explain what we're going to do today and set the scene a bit?
Please do.
Cool. So, during our session today, once I've set the scene, I'll be introducing Roberta Boscolo, who'll be talking about her work at the World Meteorological Office. And after that, I'll be asking each of our other panelists to introduce themselves, say a bit about what they do, and then we'll go into the panel discussion. We'll make sure at the end that there's plenty of time for listeners to feed in their own questions, so it won't just be us talking to each other with everyone else listening. But what is this session all about, and why now? Essentially, we're living in a time of intertwined global emergencies of climate change and biodiversity loss. We need to resolve both for the sake of our natural world and ourselves. There's rightly a lot of publicity about the global targets, agendas, and action on climate change, but far less talk about biodiversity. Yet nature is our greatest ally in the fight against climate change, and it supports our individual health and well-being, and also supports so many of aspects of our economy. In December of last year, sorry, just a moment. In December of last year, the United Nations brought governments together in Montreal for COP15, the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This convention was created in Rio in 1992, and there have been goals and targets set at various intervals since then. The task in Montreal was to set a set of goals that are going to turn the corner, take us from a time of nature loss to nature recovery, setting a vision for a nature positive future. The meetings in Montreal were actually the final step of nearly 2 years of negotiation, but they did have an outcome, which was the Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework contains 4 long-term goals, where we need to be by 2050, and 23 targets, where we need to be by 2030 to have changed course and be heading towards those long-term goals. So this global biodiversity framework Is it as ambitious as some campaigners hoped? No, but it is ambitious. Is it guaranteed to work? No. If you look back, so many of the goals that we've set ourselves for each decade under this convention have just been missed. So it's a big ask. And it's not perfect. There's some bits that maybe could be clearer, some bits that aren't mandatory that some people would have liked to make mandatory. But it sets us a challenge which actually is achievable. It also captures the sense of urgency. We need to understand, we need to commit, and we need to act. One thing at COP15 in Montreal that was new and quite different from some of the climate conferences is that the business world was really visible there. Not nudging governments and quietly calling on them to do less and don't sign us up, saying to governments, do more, saying we want mandatory targets to create a level playing field. We want action. Business wants action on nature because we can see inaction putting our businesses at risk. Essentially drumming home the message that looking after nature is sound business sense. So that, in a nutshell, is why we're here, to help us all learn more as we recognise and respond to that call for action, to be part of that change of direction towards nature recovery. So I hope that's given you a flavour for why we're here today. And I'm going to now invite Roberta to introduce herself and say a little bit about where she works, and then I'll ask a few questions of her, and then we'll introduce the rest of the panel. So Roberta, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Claire, and thank you for inviting me to this roundtable and to share our experience with such a distinguished participant. So I'm Roberta Boscolo, and I'm a science lead for climate and energy at the World Meteorological Organization. So the World Meteorological Organization is a specialized agency of the United Nations, and is also the authoritative voice for weather, water, and climate. The headquarters is in Geneva, Switzerland, and this is where I am now, and I've been here since 2009. So especially my work here focus on how to harness the power of the climate data and the information that we generate in support of decision-making of key sectors. And for me, is actually, my focus is on the energy sector. So about 10 years ago, WMO spearheaded an initiative called the Global Framework for Climate Services, and to make sure that the information that we generate as an agency is used for climate adaptation, mitigation, and the public and the private sector. We realized back 10 years ago that there is a disconnection between the community of the data and information providers like us and those who actually should access this information and should use it to develop their climate resilience strategy or optimizing the carbonization strategies. So my work is to connect with all these stakeholders to make sure that the climate services cycle is not broken, and we keep providing better services and better value to the society. Finally, I just want to say that our vision in the World Meteorological Organization is a global, and one of my focus is also to create capacity in those countries, especially the developing countries, that don't have the capacity of the developed countries to serve some key sectors. And I help them to access and use the climate data and develop information which is tailored for the national needs.
Thank you, Roberta. That was a great introduction. Got a few questions to explore. The first one is actually about thinking of COP15 on biodiversity. That really did have a hugely increased global profile, but action on biodiversity loss is still at a much earlier stage than action on climate change. We know we need to do more on climate, but do you think there are lessons from the efforts on climate change that can be shared with those who are striving to get momentum and awareness around biodiversity loss?
Yes, so actually, I think there are key lessons to learn, but just let me say that we can also argue that the negotiation of the climate change are also not progressing as fast, at least as fast as the scientists recommend, in order to avoid the most devastating consequences of climate change. But yes, I agree that, you know, this COP, especially the one in COP15 on biodiversity loss in December, generated a significant increase of global awareness and also attention to the issues of biodiversity loss. And as you pointed out, a significant action to address these issues is still on the early stage compared to, I think, to the climate change. But there are certainly, as I said, lessons from that we can learn from what is happening in the climate change sphere. And one important lesson is the need for a strong, consistent messaging about the urgency of the issue. And the potential consequences also of inaction. These messages can be used to engage with the public and the political and to build the political support for the action. And also, I attended several COPs of climate change in the last few years. And my take is that in these gatherings, negotiation among the parties or the countries are just one part of the whole event. And while these governments struggle to reach sometimes a meaningful and bold accord, the other actors like businesses, civil society, academy, and NGO are pushing for great transformation. So another important lesson, as you said before, is the need to build a coalition of stakeholders for different sectors and disciplines to work together towards a common goal. These include, as I said, civil society organization, the private sector, the scientific community. And it's also important to acknowledge that addressing biodiversity loss will require a wide range of solutions as well. And these solutions are also in the sphere of policy, legislative measures, economic incentives, and community-based approaches. And finally, I think monitoring and reporting on the progress in addressing biodiversity loss also is crucial for measuring progress, identify the areas where additional action is needed, and for holding governments accountable and other actors accountable. So it is true that both COPs are not, the changes are not happening as fast, as I said, as fast as the scientists are recommended. But I think we can learn from each other and to get better, you know, while we go forward to this diplomatic, in this diplomatic world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What are your thoughts in terms of the impacts on the environment and how we deal with them, about the interaction between climate change and loss of biodiversity from your own work?
Yes, so the interaction between climate change and loss of biodiversity is a complex and interrelated issue with significant impacts also on the planet and also in the human society. Climate change can have a direct impact on the biodiversity, for example, by altering the range of distribution of species, their migration patterns, their reproductive success, and also pushing for changes in the timing of the life cycle of events such flowering of and migration. So climate change can also cause shifts in ecosystems, altering the balances of the species and leading to changes in the composition and the structure of ecosystems. And on the other hand, loss of biodiversity can exacerbate also climate change. Mm-hmm. So, for example, by reducing the capacity of the ecosystem to sequester the carbon and regulate local and regional climates. For example, deforestation and other form or land use are significant sources of greenhouse gases emissions. And the loss of carbon-rich peatlands and forests and grassland can lead to substantial emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So what I say is that, you know, the relationship actually between climate change and biodiversity loss is multidirectional. Mm-hmm. And have impacts which are not just limited to the natural world, but have also important implication on the human society as well. And addressing both of these global challenges will require an integrated collaborative efforts from all sectors of society. And as I said before, we need to have a vision which includes also governments, civil society, organizations, private sectors, and also individuals as well.
Thank you. And with your own work, you're obviously very deeply involved in the scientific study with climate. And in the same way that we're recognizing the climate change and biodiversity losses, emergencies are sort of intertwined and we need to deal with them both. As well as finding solutions, there's also scientific research to understand the challenges and record change. How do you see the scientific studies of nature helping our understanding of climate change and potentially vice versa as well?
Sure, I think this is a very interesting question, and it goes back to actually what I said before, because I think the scientific studies of nature, plays a very crucial role in understanding climate change and its impact on the natural worlds. So research in the biodiversity, ecosystems, and their functioning help us to better understand the interaction between species, ecosystem, the physical and the chemical processes that regulate the Earth climate. And this research provides important information about the ways in which climate change is affecting the natural world and the way in which changes in biodiversity and ecosystem can impact also the Earth climate system. I was recently reading an article regarding the Amazon forest degradation and the fact that such forest destruction can push this ecosystem to a tipping point and to a critical transition to a dry state. And such new states have a global impact, not just in the region of the Amazon. And because there are teleconnection with this kind of tipping point area with others, tipping points in other parts of the world, which are elements, critical elements of the Earth system. And they found that the Amazon rainforest area is connected, for example, to the Tibetan plateau, which is known as the third pole, and is providing water to all the region and of the Asia, many countries in Asia, and also the West Antarctic area. So this is how, you know, the system is really interconnected, and we need to be careful to look at it in a very comprehensive way. So similarly, research in climate change can inform our understanding of the biodiversity loss. For example, the impacts of climate change on species distribution, mitigation patterns, reproductive success can help us to better understand ways in which climate change is affecting biodiversity and ecosystem, and also can inform us on how better we can develop targeted conservation strategies and prioritize areas for conservation actions.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta. That's been really insightful. That's been a great start to the afternoon. Roberta will be staying for the panel session, but I'm going to now invite each of the panel members to have 5 minutes to introduce themselves, say a little bit about their own work, and maybe if they've got any sort of high-level take on what they were thinking in the run-up to the COP15 meeting last December and their feelings on the framework that resulted from it. And I'm going to turn first to Jayne Manley, who's the CEO of the Earth Trust. And I won't tell you what the Earth Trust is because I know she's about to tell us all about it.
Hi, and thank you. I mean, it's great to be part of this panel today. Really delighted and actually honoured to be in such a steamed conversation as we're having today, but highly relevant. I've got a series of slides to help you understand a little bit more about the Earth Trust. I have to say that the Global Biodiversity Framework is hugely important to the work of the Earth Trust, but we are quite a long way from global discussions in terms of what we do, although what we do is obviously highly steered by the global conversations that are happening. So thank you. I'm just going to say thank you as we move from slide to slide. So I'm Chief Executive of the Earth Trust, and the Earth Trust is a local organisation, a UK-based charity that champions access to green space. And the reason why we champion access to green space is for the benefit that access provides to people's health and well-being, to their decision-making around biodiversity and their decision-making around climate. Thank you. Next slide. So this is our strategy. It is, we need a society where everybody has access to green space and can benefit from green space. And it's important that that access is as easy as possible, but also that through that access, people gain a more deeper and meaningful connection with the environment. Because, next slide, please, it is people that are at the heart of all decision-making in wherever you are across the globe. It's people whose action and whose voices will determine whether or not we succeed. The targets themselves, a little bit of reflection for me first before I get on to some really good projects that we have done in the past. I just want to reflect on the Global Biodiversity Framework. I think going into the COP, I didn't have enormous hope for what was likely to come out, but actually for Earth Trust and our work, it is hugely important. So I just want to draw the attention of the panel to 4 key agreements that were reached. Firstly, 30 by 30. I think we will hear a lot more about that in the next conversation. There are targets around reducing pollution. There are targets around corporate reporting, and a significant expectation that there will be a greater increase in financial contribution towards biodiversity. I think what's really missing in terms of the conversation is putting people at the heart of decision making and putting people at the heart of access to biodiversity. Because as I said, for the Earth Trust, it's people and their connection with the natural world that's going to make a big difference. So that translation of global targets into local action and providing those policy levers and those opportunities and the frameworks and the funding to enable people to make the right decisions is crucially important. And I've got a few examples, next slide please, got a few examples of where we've made a big difference here in the UK. So firstly, this is a discussion about construction, and during COVID we built a new building, designed and constructed a new building. And this building is called Earth Lab. It's a connection with the natural world for many young people. It's built giving a sense of place and location in an engaging, as an engaging manner as possible. But it also stretches construction materials, it stretches supply chains, it stretches us and our thinking about how to build constructively construction in future. So how to build sustainably in future. Next slide, please. Secondly, I just want to give another example. This is River of Life. So this is a big construction project, still within the working landscape that we care for in South Oxfordshire, and it is the largest wetland creation project on the banks of the River Thames. Hugely important. All our projects contribute to biodiversity targets, but also contribute to climate targets, as well as to people's health and well-being. Next slide, please. And finally, I just want to draw your attention to one of the key strands of the COP targets, which is around investing more in the future. And in 2013, we set about becoming part of a different partnership whereby the predecessor to Biodiversity Net Gain was developed. It was called Biodiversity Offsetting, and funding from a development actually was directed at improving chalk grassland, chalk downland here in South Oxfordshire. So several years on, we have now proved that funding that comes from a different partnership, from a developer, can actually contribute significantly to biodiversity delivery on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayne. That's just been a really inspiring snapshot of examples. That was great. I'm next going to hand over to Chris Gerrard from Anglian Water and invite you to introduce yourselves and say a bit about what you do and your thoughts on biodiversity.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's great to be here today, and I look forward to the discussion that we have over the next hour or so. So I'm Chris Gerrard. I'm the Catchment and Biodiversity Manager at Anglian Water. Anglian Water is one of the UK water companies. We cover about a quarter of England in a part of the country which is particularly vulnerable from a biodiversity perspective. We cover the eastern side of the country, north of London. We're a low-lying part of England. We have only 2/3 of the average rainfall in the UK, and we have a soft, low-lying coastline, and we have about half of England's most valuable farmland in our region as well. All of that means that historically the biodiversity in our region has been significantly impacted. A lot of conversion to agriculture, a lot of loss due to the growth of towns and cities and roads and rail across our region as well. And it's very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and continued growth. So we have a lot of challenges as a business to carry out our water and water recycling services for our 6 million customers, but do that in a way that supports and enhances biodiversity and indeed the communities that we serve. I guess that when we approached COP15, I was interested and hopeful that it would get a higher profile than previous biodiversity COPs have had. And as you said, Claire, I think that did prove to be the case. And part of that was perhaps because we were emerging from the pandemic, and certainly in England, the pandemic lit a bit of a light under people's interest in their local biodiversity. Where can they go and get their exercise? Where can they see wildlife? Where can they get some green space? So I was hopeful that we would have some a good outcome from COP15, and I think that's what we got on the whole. The goals and targets that were set are pretty comprehensive and maybe lacking in detail in some parts, but nevertheless cover the sort of key areas such as protecting species and restoring habitats, ensuring the benefits that nature gives to humans continue to flow, addressing things like invasive species and pollution, and supporting communities and people around the world to get an equitable share of that biodiversity value. So I was quite happy with, on the whole, how COP15 ended. But as you said, Claire, the targets have been set and missed in the past, and so I'm really particularly interested in, so from a UK perspective, what we do here to bring those targets into concrete plans of action so that we can work together to actually achieve those targets. I'm also somewhat optimistic, I have to say, because we have in the past had a new Environment Act, we had a new Agriculture Act, and that is hopefully laying a bit of a foundation for some of the things that we need to see happen for nature's recovery. So if we have a well-planned and well-resourced agri-environment program that farmers can buy into, if we have biodiversity net gain that works, that allows developers to make meaningful contribution to nature recovery and allow for growth, then hopefully we'll be able to make much more progress on these targets than we have on previous ones. I guess to finish off from Anglian Water's perspective, we're obviously a construction company as well. We build pipelines, we build water treatment works, and so on. And we do that largely to meet environmental targets. So if we have to improve the quality of water we're putting into a river, we often find ourselves traditionally doing something that impacts the environment in another way. If we pour a lot of concrete, if we use a lot of chemical, if we use a lot of energy to achieve a water quality objective, we're just driving climate change in the wrong direction as well. So my wish in this country and around the world would be that we really recognise this is a genuine nature and climate crisis, and that government gets behind mechanisms to allow the different parts of the economy to sort of zoom out from the problem right in front of their noses and really strongly collaborate. So we can partner up, we can co-fund, we can solve problems together. And I believe if we do it in that way, then we'll be able to make much more rapid progress on nature recovery, but also mitigating climate change as well. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. One of the things we've touched on a couple of times spoken is the importance of nature to people's health and well-being. And our next panel member is somebody this is particularly relevant to, John Vesey from West Midlands 5G in the health and care sector. So John, I'll ask you to introduce yourself and say a bit about your own work and your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Like others, grateful to be on this panel and also to join the conversation later and to keep learning. I think that's key for me. I think Chris just touched on it. The ability to take a step back from the immediate problems is really what our organisation is trying to offer, particularly in my area around health and care. How do we support organisations to do like Roberta was saying and look at the systems that are inherent in the challenges facing these areas, whether that's in construction and biodiversity, whether that's in how nature benefits people's health and well-being, or how it can also help in recovery and prevention or reduction of illness. And so we work predominantly in the UK, looking at how do we support people to understand their options and give them the space to think through the implications of those options. We're there to sort of facilitate that space and look at that. And so, yeah, today is another great example of that, where we get a chance to hear from a range of different people and take in and take on that advice and hear from it. And so for me, that's kind of the lens I looked at COP15 through, as, you know, what more can I learn? How does this link to the areas of interest that we have around One Health, and that sort of overlap between how do you find that integrated approach to balancing and optimizing health of people, animals and the environment, and what are the trade-offs that you get with that, and therefore what are the chances that we can have those conversations with a range of people, either in the UK or in the supply chains that we work with overseas. How are we influencing, both in a negative and sometimes in a positive way, those decisions, and how are we, again, I think as has been said by Jayne, you know, how do we make sure that people are at the centre of that? How do we make sure that it's still people that have the choice, but at least it's an informed choice? You know, they know what the consequences are of building in a particular way, you know, fighting for public transport in a particular way, looking at infrastructure and the landscape of infrastructure in relation to how they want to live in community, in society, and hopefully move away from, I guess, what seems to be being advertised, certainly in the UK, as the panacea of finding a way to be wealthy enough to exit from society seems to be our goal. And for some reason, I'd like to work on reversing that and actually being, how do we contribute to society? How do we contribute to nature and be part of it and get all the benefits from being part of it, rather than thinking it's something to try and earn our way out of.
Thank you, John. And our final panel member today is Margarita Skarku from 2150. Margarita, would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Sure, thanks, Claire. And yeah, echoing the other panelists, very humbled to be part of this and to learn from everybody. So I probably come at this from a slightly different angle. I work at 2150, which is a venture capital fund. We're a climate tech fund, so very much focusing on backing technologies and companies that have a positive impact on climate and biodiversity. We see as an extension of that, and I can certainly expand on that in a moment, but also looking for a financial return. So, you know, very much see biodiversity as an opportunity from a financial point of view, but also for climate from many different angles. I'm originally civil and environmental engineer, so this sort of intersection of the built environment and this topic is very much something I'm interested in. Spent a long time in finance, and as part of that career, got to work on things like TCFD and saw the beginnings of TNFD from inside a large bank. And what does that mean? And how do we start to even think about monitoring and reporting on nature? And so that's also been a very interesting sort of narrative and evolution to observe. I mean, I guess I won't comment too much on COP15. I think everything's already been said. The main point I would echo is that it's great that we have this commitment. Now let's actually do something about it, because I think on the climate COP, you know, we've seen that, yes, there was a big sort of patting on each other's back after Paris, and there has been some progress made, but you know, to talk about the UK, we're not on track whatsoever to hit those commitments. And again, you know, there's a lot of patting on our backs when we were the first country to legislate the commitments, but actually, unless you achieve that, it's completely pointless. And so I think that's the main thing. And you know, coming at it from a kind of venture capitalist perspective, where we do see the technologies that exist, we're very close to what's actually possible right now. There's a lot that's possible on sort of climate more broadly, but specifically biodiversity. And so let's actually kind of focus on implementing some of those solutions and being quite ambitious so that we can avoid the sort of sixth extinction that we're on the route to right now. I think more broadly, and it does sort of link to that, a topic that I'm very interested is, you know, how do you come up with a really consistent and user-friendly way to value some of these ecosystem services? Because at the end of the day, that is often what it comes down to, is actually being able to place a value. And particularly when you think about, you know, Roberta touched on it, but you know, a lot of the large rainforests, which obviously provide a lot of value that has a very direct impact on weather patterns and on climate change. You know, what are the incentives if you're from a country, whether that's Brazil or Indonesia or the DRC, where there's a lot of social inequality, there's a lot of poverty, and you know, you're being asked to preserve nature for the benefit of the whole world, but in reality, you know, you could be using that land to gain a much more direct and immediate sort of economic benefit. So that's a topic that I'm very interested in. I'm doing quite a bit of work with the UKRI on this topic as well, about how do you actually think about placing value on nature that is translatable in a very direct fashion.
Thank you, Margarita. I think that point about social justice between people, between countries, there's so much complexity to all of this.
Yeah,
it's really important.
And I think that was something that, I mean, I wasn't sort of obviously involved in negotiations, but I think that was a topic that came up even in the final moments of the COP15 agreement, where you had, you know, certain countries from Africa sort of saying, this is great, but we actually need more funds to preserve and conserve, you know, our natural habitats, and where's that going to come from? And to my understanding, there wasn't really a response. And so I really think that's sort of fundamental, because this is a global issue. I think every country kind of has the responsibility for its own land, but you know, we do also need to think about it from a global perspective.
Sure, thank you. So thank you, everybody. We've all introduced ourselves now. Steve, just before we leap into the round table, shall we take a quick pause?
Yes, I think that would be a good idea. I mean, there's an article that I'm going to share in the chat so that you can have a look at, something that may be of interest, which is something that's been announced today, actually, which is that every household in the UK, or rather in England, I should narrow that down, every household in England will be within a 15-minute walk of a green space or water. This is under a major environmental improvement plan for England set out by the government today. So there'll surely be lots of discussion about that, one to think about while we take a break. But also, I just want to say to everybody here in the audience that if you have questions for our panelists during the, immediately after the roundtable, they will be addressing those questions. So by all means, put those into the chat and we can come to as many of those as we can, depending on time, towards the end of the session. Something else to mention is that we always say on Constructive Voices that the conversation's building, and we want, during 2023, particularly with discussions like this one, to really bring everybody together and to create a community so that people can really have that conversation in a combined forum. You know, everyone's having these discussions in boardrooms, in meeting rooms around the world, but we want to bring those discussions together so that the built environment can work together and can hear best practice, and that's why we're doing events like this. So please follow us on social media, sign up for newsletters, and look at our website. There's the podcast, of course, which is how this all started, what seems like many years ago, but it wasn't actually that long ago. Pete's smiling there. We've had some fun on the podcast, and you can get that in all the usual podcast places as well. So please join with us and make sure the conversation does continue building with all your brilliant insights that you share with us. We're going to take a break for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back with our panelists and have a roundtable discussion and then answer your questions. So I think we'll take a break, and I'm going to share with you some David Attenborough. I mean, You know, who doesn't love David Attenborough? So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back very, very soon as we continue our event this afternoon. So welcome back from the break. This part of the event is our roundtable. Claire will be leading this once again, and we'll be hearing from our panelists as they discuss various issues around biodiversity, the challenges, the solutions, and their thoughts. Also, a reminder that if you have a question for the panel, we will bring those to you, as many as we possibly can, towards the end of our event today. And you can put those in the chat and we will come to them a little later. So, Claire, back to you after the break. And this is going to be an interesting roundtable discussion, I think.
Thank you, Steve. So yes, I'd encourage people to put questions into the chat, please, and we will pick up as many as we can later on. So I'm going to start by asking the panel, and we won't be asking, I'm not going to be picking on people, and I'm not going to be asking everybody to answer every single question. So just do chip in when you've got thoughts, because obviously some questions are more relevant to different individuals. First one's really just to say, to invite people to reflect on, why does this all matter? What are the big things? It's easy to focus on the doom and gloom of, you know, we're all doomed if we don't act, but what are the benefits of acting on, particularly to look after the biodiversity of the world?
Guess I can make a start on that, Claire. I suppose from a biodiversity perspective, there's always been two ways to look at the natural world, isn't it? There's one belief that it should exist for its own benefits anyway, and we just have a duty as human stewards of the planet to look after biodiversity. But then again, we recognise that biodiversity has many tangible benefits for us as individuals, as communities as well, and I think we can all see both sides of that. So I suppose at that level, seeing the decline of species and the habitat decline as well in extent and quality means the potential for the benefits of those habitats and biodiversity for people is very diminished. Whether that's withstanding impacts like extreme weather, whether it's the sort of medicinal potential of habitats or species in habitats around the world. There's all sorts of ways in which nature enriches us as human societies. And reflecting in my own region, we have this sort of creeping normalcy, it's been referred to, hasn't it? Whereas my great-grandparents would have looked across my part of the world and it would have looked very, very differently. And my children will look at it very, very differently, and they assume that's normal, but actually what we have is a very depauperate environment. And personally, I feel very much that a lot of my mental well-being comes from experiencing nature and being out in the natural world as well. So the fewer people have direct access to that, I think it has direct impacts on the well-being as us as individuals, as families and communities.
I can quickly come in on that as well, and building on what Chris has said, just as a kind of investor in the room to add some numbers and sort of disclosure. We've invested into a biodiversity measurement monitoring company called Nature Metrics, and at the time of that investment, we did a lot of work on exactly this question, because, you know, at the end of the day, as I said, you know, we have to be investing into parts of the market that are large enough and where there is a real need. And one of the most interesting stats we came up with that has sort of been cross-validated is that more than half of the world's 44 trillion GDP depends on nature. And I think that takes many shapes and forms, and Chris touched on the most important ones, but, you know, food security and sort of the importance of pollinators, I think that's been reported on a lot recently, but it is, you know, fundamentally important, and majority of the food that we eat depends on that vital role that, you know, organisms within a healthy ecosystem provide. You know, medicines, pharmaceuticals, again, it's one that I actually wasn't hugely aware of, and learning increasingly more about. I think it's fascinating. You know, I think there's also then a point around viruses and the risk of not protecting nature, the risk of constantly encroaching on habitats that you know, are non-human, and the risk that creates for certain zoonotic diseases jumping, you know, to humans and things. So I think it's, yeah, there's real numbers as well to back up that question around why is this important.
Can I come in? Because for me, the loss of biodiversity is a symptom of a really unhealthy planet. So when I'm seeing loss of habitats and loss of species, there's something fundamentally wrong with our ecosystems and damaged about the ecosystems here on Earth, and they are not sustaining life on this planet. And life on this planet is about us as well as the other habitats and species that we're talking about. So fundamentally, we are seeing a breakdown in ecosystems and life on Earth. And if there can be anything bigger than loss of biodiversity, it has to be the health of our planet. And so for me, that's big, that's huge. And yes, we should be addressing and halting the loss of biodiversity, but let's look at the ecosystems, let's look at the soil, let's look at the air, let's look at the water, and let's get those right, and think about ecosystems as a whole. Because if we get the ecosystems right, then we will all survive and thrive.
Thank you. And what I know a lot of people in the audience are very aware of this, but just invite you to talk a little bit across the panel about what's the key drivers people need to be aware of that are causing biodiversity loss, and maybe some of the ones that we haven't thought about enough.
People.
Yeah, maybe I can say something more. And people is true. I agree definitely with Margherita. But I just want to say that, you know, according to the IPCC recent studies, we know that the loss of biodiversity is proportional to the temperature increase. So this is putting at risk, as I said, pollination, water availability, clean water, air, food security, and also coastal habitat. And also that we know that effective adaptation cannot prevent all the losses and damages, and above 1.5 degrees, some natural solutions may not work. So, you know, many species and ecosystems are currently near or beyond their hard adaptation limits, and the people that depends on, rely on them to survive, say the most vulnerable, are currently near or beyond their soft adaptation limits. So people and human activities is actually causing all this disruption.
I guess we've got a global audience here, so some of the most important habitats around the world are being lost through primary conversion, so loss of Amazon rainforest to cattle ranching, for example, is still a big driver for some of the globally important habitats around the world. More locally, where I am in the UK and perhaps much of Western Europe as well, perhaps we've gone past the sort of the major period of gross habitat loss, and we're actually experiencing habitat impacts which are less directly tangible. So things like invasive species or pollution, or indeed simply the lack of management of habitats of conservation value as well. So there are multiple drivers for this, and the key to it is understanding, you know, which ones are predominant in our parts of the world, and what are the policy levers that need to be moved in order to halt them and move them into opportunities for nature recovery.
And just to add one point, one of the things I found really fascinating as I continue to learn about this topic is that removal of certain keystone species has such a massive impact on the rest of that ecosystem. And so I think, you know, overfishing is a great example where a lot of the large predators have been overfished, you know, other creatures and organisms then essentially overproduce, and that has a sort of deadly impact on the rest of that ecosystem. And I think that that's another one to sort of be very aware of, that as soon as you kind of remove one thing, that ecosystem that has developed this balance over hundreds of thousands of years is all of a sudden left in a kind of different situation, and it you know, doesn't necessarily recover.
Thank you. So the first couple of questions, we've looked a bit about what the problems are and why it's all our fault. But seriously, what we've done and what we're still doing that's causing these challenges. For the rest of the session, I think we're going to try and look at the positive part of this. So what do we need to do about it all? And I'd welcome thoughts initially on just the scale of the challenge. So what could look like? How different is it going to look when we've got this change of direction? And just, we won't instantly go from nature loss to nature recovery, but what are the sort of changes that we're going to need to make?
Can I start?
Please.
I think my answer to this is huge and significant and seismic in terms of words that I would describe how we need to be and develop thoughts, develop concepts, the technology around this, the way we think about biodiversity and the way we think about and address climate change and health and well-being need to be thought of within the same sphere. So we shouldn't be taking one and putting policy measures and levers in place for one without considering across the piece. One of the ones that I think is, so I sit and work in southeast England, an area of high pressure, lots of growth and development, lots of people, limited access to green space, and one of the things, but multiple land use demands as time goes on. And one of the things that would make a real difference to the decision making and the development here in my part of the world is a better plan around land use, because there are going to be competing demands for that land. That land has to produce food, it has to produce clean water, it has to give people access to nature, it has to produce biodiversity at a much bigger scale than it has. And it has to produce clean energy. And all those, if we're not careful, could be seen to be competing. And the challenge for us all is that we need to develop strategies and plans that are relevant locally, that we can follow locally, but actually where the contributions build up to success for climate, to success for biodiversity, and to success for health and well-being. So in my part of the world, a land use strategy in England, a good, well-described land use strategy would make a huge difference and sort of signifies the different way of working and thinking in future.
Yeah, I agree. I think seismic is absolutely right. It is a massive challenge that we have to reverse nature loss. And I guess it is going to require change at an individual level, how we live our lives, the food we eat, the choices we make when we buy things. The organisations we work for need to recognise that we're all part of the problem and part of the solution, and we need to work together. Governments and international organisations need to drive ambition and really push forward for that. Speaking directly to finance, Margarita, the finance markets, increasingly look at this, recognising that investment is going to fail if we don't address the climate and biodiversity crisis as well. So there's changes, massive changes at every scale that we need to see. I agree, your point, Jayne, around that sort of land use strategy, and hopefully in England we'll get that with nature recovery strategies for the first time on a statutory footing, a really helpful framework and map that all parts of society can work towards. So hopefully that will become a bit of an exemplar for how we can genuinely deliver it, and how we can plan how people will access the environment. We can put a wood in the middle of nowhere, which is great for biodiversity, but perhaps no good for people. Build a wood on the edge of a town that can be delivered for biodiversity, for people, for flood, for climate, all sorts of things. So that sort of spatial planning is really, really important, and I'm super looking forward to seeing how they'll help us in Anglian Water do our job. Final thing for us is the drive towards nature-based solutions. How can we have a kind of nature-first approach? Where can we solve problems by creating biodiversity, by not pouring concrete? And if solutions are achievable, are viable technologically, then what are the policy blockers that are preventing us from doing that? Let's get those out of the way so we can funnel lots of resource into nature-based solutions as the first and preferred option.
Thank you, Chris. One thing you touched on was that where you put something matters. So put a wood next to a town, people have access, there's the well-being and health benefits of that. I was thinking for everybody, one thing that I reflect on when I look at these sort of interventions is actually stepping back and looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There's this long list of things we need to do. There's the climate emergency, the biodiversity loss emergency, but actually there's lots and lots of other things as well. And we know nature restoration in the right place can help with climate, can help with health. I just invite people, have you got examples from your own experience of win-win approaches, where you've got something that's maybe got one primary driver to what's happened, but it's given these multiple benefits?
It's, I guess, probably a bit more of a local example than some of the SDGs get reported at, but a few years ago, the NHS in England and Wales did a programme around healthy new towns, and so worked with the construction industry across multiple sites in England, Wales, and different parts to demonstrate ways in which new builds or new villages or new sites within existing towns or completely new locations could be developed with communities, nature, and active travel or public transport travel in mind. And so construction companies were invited in to bid into that work, to develop with local people having a voice on that. And so it was trying to move towards that vision of what are the fundamentals that work in different places. And actually, for me, what worked really well with that program was the learnings that they took from each of the sites. So they didn't stipulate that, one site's got the best uptake, therefore we must always build it exactly like that in all other 10 sites. It was looking at what are the ingredients that has made that uptake interesting. What is it that the developer's done? How is it that they've engaged? How is it that the community's responded? And how do you foster that environment that makes it be a local decision? Because it's typically at that level of engagement that we need to look at. And so I understand where Chris and Jayne are coming from in terms of the scale, but I think sometimes we need to be careful that we don't just talk about it at that seismic scale, because then it's very off-putting. And I was reminded in a session that Michael Marmot was running recently on health equity about the fact that there's a quote from Raymond Williams that talks about to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than making despair convincing. And I think sometimes we're walking that tightrope in these areas of, yes, we want people to know it's a big deal, but then sometimes it feels like their only option is to be angry at large institutions, whether public or private, rather than take an active interest in what can I do, you know, on my doorstep with an organisation like Earth Trust, or in my neighbourhood, and always assume it's someone else's responsibility or someone else's fault. And I think, yeah, there is something to Chris's point about how do we make sure that we own the fact that we're part of the problem and part of the solution. Unfortunately, we're not all equally part of the problem. And maybe we need to reflect that in part of the solution too, you know, in nationally and internationally. But I think at a local level, we do need to swallow that a little bit of recognizing that not all of this has been caused by, you know, me or the person I live next door to, but that's kind of irrelevant. We can all choose to be angry at it and do nothing, and then it's only going to get worse, or we can all swallow the fact that we're not all part of it, but we could maybe do something small that is going to make it a bit better.
I think that's one of the big challenges, isn't it, John? That that because the scope, the size of the challenge is so big,
yeah,
that trying to enable people to connect locally with nature and get them to understand that they can make a difference, and each of their small changes that they make can build into something that addresses these seismic challenges. But I think one of the key things that the Earth Trust focuses on human decision making, because it's us all. We all make decisions day to day about what we do, and the damage, let's say, that we cause the environment, or the positive contribution we make. And because as a society we've lost our connection with the environment, and we don't understand I don't think we understand the impact of our decision making, that's a problem for society. So building these communities that want to make change happen, all our communities should be being built and supported to make change happen, and then we can really eat away at these huge challenges.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's also something underpinning that too, though, that I think even where communities want to come together and address this, particularly in some of the more advanced economies, advanced purely from a GDP point of view rather than from a healthy point of view, because they're often at opposite ends of the spectrum. But I think sometimes we've developed society in such a way that we don't allow people time to think about this stuff. We keep them so busy and so focused on growth at all costs that we don't do what, you know, you put up on your slides about Earth Trust being about how do people thrive. And I think we unfortunately sometimes translate thriving meaning economic growth. And oftentimes those things are not a good match. And so we can thrive with great construction, great buildings, great infrastructure, and not always be about let's drive GDP.
Thank you. I've got a few more questions I could ask, but I'm going to just ask one more before we start to look at the ones from the listeners in the virtual room. Has anyone got any messages to share, thinking focused specifically on the built environment industry, which is obviously particularly relevant to Constructive Voices? Are there any key sort of challenges and opportunities for people working in that context?
I guess one is, I'm thinking about water, which I'm bound to at some point today. So it's one of the most obviously sort of connected parts of the natural world, isn't it? And if we're thinking about development and how you know, the houses that we're living in now, the infrastructure that we have now is going to be existing when climate change projections are, you know, at full tilt. we need to think about how we can retrofit them to both be water efficient, but also then to manage the threat of flooding and extreme rainfall events through the use of sustainable drainage systems, which will then deliver a wider biodiversity benefit for communities living there. So that link you placed in the chat, Steve, around people moving within 15 minutes, you can imagine that retrofit SUDs in our communities where that's possible could play a component of doing that. Similarly, at the other end, the treatment of water, one of the things we're very interested in doing is using treatment wetlands, where we're using the power of nature to treat the water rather than pouring more concrete and using more energy as well. So if we can start to think about the natural world as a connected system and recognize that different bits of society and the economy are connected to it, it goes back to my first point around how we can collaborate and plan much better, particularly for those parts of the world like the one we're in the southeast of England, which are going to be, in one hand short of water and then at periods of time have too much water on our hands to deal with.
I guess, Claire, from my perspective, it comes back to I guess how you sort of summarised this whole round table. It's about how do we understand, commit, and act. And I think for me, I need to recognise that I don't know enough about the construction industry, but what I do know is there's some incredible work going on, and there's been some incredible effort over years and decades to look at these challenges, and let's start from a position of let's understand that and work with those that are on that journey, rather than assume that they don't know this stuff or that they aren't interested in these topics. We all started this conversation by saying it's the importance of bringing expertise together and to keep learning together. I think some of the challenges that the construction and built environment sectors have faced and continue to face are frankly insane, what they're having to deal with and cope with, to then also being thrown this as, right, you also need to fix this without any additional long-term support or mechanisms to engage or grow or skills and capability to train. I think they're doing some phenomenal things in this space, and actually these sorts of sessions are how do we learn from what they're doing in tight economic situations, and how do we share some of that from a spatial point of view, because they'll have their own spatial plans about what could go where and when, and Jayne knows I'm sat in a similar part of England to Jayne, and it does sometimes feel like there's lots of growth going on and lots of building going on, but statistically speaking, it's nothing compared with other parts of England or certainly other countries. And so how do we do what we want to do locally in construction and built environment, but also encourage it to happen maybe more fairly or more in keeping with what we want collectively, rather than saying, let's protect this because it's a city that we think is worth protecting and these other cities aren't worth protecting, so we'll just keep building on them. That's not the fault of the construction or the built environment sectors. That's something we need to discuss at a broader scale, I think. And I think for me, it's how do I get better understanding of what the challenges are before we expect commitment and action.
And from my perspective, I see a whole lot of really good work going on to develop thinking around construction and testing new approaches in terms of construction. I think one of the things that the construction industry can do really well is doing that permeability to the environment. So recognizing that the landscape in which that built environment sits is just as important as the building itself, and designing the development and the landscaping, the green landscaping of that development in harmony to enable that connection between people and the environment.
I think as well, Claire, it's one of the sorry, Roberta, it's one of the questions as well in the chat around the biodiversity net gain legislation and, you know, whether that 10% is enough. But I think, you know, I think that there's no moving away from the fact that, you know, buildings and infrastructure and construction in general, one of the key kind of contributors to habitat loss. And, you know, yes, there are actions that are being taken and there's legislation being put in place, and that's really helpful. But I think it's as well, you know, it's what Jayne just mentioned, like where there are spaces, just because there's a green space, it's not a given that that is necessarily a big contributor to biodiversity. And so how do you maximize the space you have, and how do you also set ambitious targets as a construction firm to do more and do better? I think the legislation that exists in various countries is helpful, but you know, that shouldn't be the goal, right? That should be the bare minimum, and that's something that we often sort of challenge the large engineering firms that we talk to, that, you know, how do you set yourself up as a leader in this space in recognition that this is ultimately a big contributor to human health and so many other aspects. In the final comment I'd make is that, going back to the point around solutions, there are solutions out there that can help to achieve some of these outcomes. And, you know, one example, this isn't a company that we've invested in, but there's a company called eConcrete, which focuses on concrete for marine settings, and they've developed a concrete that is specifically, you know, beneficial and enhances biodiversity rather than causing further harm. And so I think it's also about being proactive to identify solutions such as that can actually benefit the environment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that from the point of view of the climate change, I mean, we know that buildings contribute to 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. So very important for the construction to come out with a solution to make this building carbon neutral. And there are a lot of examples on this, you know, more isolations because less consumption, heat pumps instead of gas, and all sorts of solutions that you know, it's a big contribution of this community to reduce the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gases emissions. So I see from this aspect key players, key stakeholders, and that hold the key solutions to climate change.
I think it's also good, you know, it's worth noting, you know, organizations like 2150 are obviously incentivizing some of that change as well, right? And there are government schemes too as well. But I don't know if we're allowed, but Steve, Pete, what do you see as the opportunity, and where have you seen it through your conversations? You know, are there enough incentives to be making those changes in construction, or is it still small and in corners and in pockets?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for asking the question. Being honest, I don't think there's enough of a drive just being a boots on the ground type of a builder.
Yeah.
I think regulation has to change. I think there's movements in certain aspects of construction in general in terms of heating systems, and certainly there's been upgrades in terms of the energy efficiency of our buildings. But I think we need to start moving more in the direction now of not just how efficient our homes are when they're built. It has to be now the carbon footprint that is created through our construction itself. And there's steps going in the right direction, but in terms of it being mainstream, I don't think we're anywhere where we need to be yet. And I think there has to be a big push and a big support from the powers that be globally. And I really do think that this is something that has to be done globally. It's great to hear Margarita saying that, you know, her outlook is on how biodiversity and climate change can be also a good investment, because let's be honest, it is the best investment. What's the point in having anything, investing in anything, if it's only going to depreciate due to climate change and due to our whole environment? So I suppose to answer the question, it's we have made some steps in the right direction, but I really do feel some more dramatic steps that need to be made. We've had some really interesting people on the podcast. We've had some great guests, and they've given great insights. But I think your analogy of pockets is probably the best one to use. There's a lot of very good ideas that at this moment in time haven't been fully joined together. But how we do that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges, because I think there is a lot of very good ideas out there, and it's how they all get linked together to create a system that everybody can kind of join into, that will get us to where we need to be, is the way I would look at it.
Okay.
Thank you, John and Pete. Steve, we've got a few questions in from the audience now. How would you like us to run this? Shall I just...
Do you want me to be your not very glamorous assistant and read them out, and then the panel can answer them? Actually, we've got one on email here from Sue Guang from DTU Wind and Energy Systems. She's saying, I'm asking the following question: are there concerns on the biodiversity of ocean due to the rapid deployment of offshore wind farms? What can we do to protect and promote biodiversity in the ocean while developing offshore wind farms? So I don't know who wants to take that one.
I can comment. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer. I think it's a great example of the tension that sometimes exists between climate change and actions that are being taken to mitigate climate change and biodiversity. I think the one thing I'll say is that a lot of the largest offshore wind farm companies are really focusing on this, and partly that's being driven by regulation and by policy and increasing recognition that you can't be benefiting climate but at the same time sort of completely depleting the biodiversity of that particular environment. And so one of the companies that we've been speaking to about this topic is a company called Ørsted. They're one of the largest offshore wind farm companies. They're very much focusing on this, and often I think you can't avoid the fact that constructing these massive turbines and putting them in place is going to have a negative impact. It's about what you do, how do you contribute, plus then some to ensure that damage is made up. And that the starting point to that is often measuring what is that impact that you're having. And Nature Metrics company that we've invested in, that's exactly what they enable. They actually enable measurement. So measure it and then kind of hold these companies to account, because in many cases it is inevitable, as in that. But the world does need more renewable energy.
I think that's a key point. Knowing what's there, knowing what the impacts are, but actually that measuring and delivering on what's been promised. I think that's something that applies across the whole built development industry. Is if somebody's getting permission to do a scheme, then promises are made, commitments are made at that point, and it's really important to make sure that those things happen. Yeah. Because if something's supposed to give a net benefit and it doesn't, then those promises weren't real. And you come back to the basics of, if you're going to be trusted, you need to be trustworthy. Yeah. It's not just a paper exercise. This is about, with carbon and with nature, what happens on the ground or under the sea in this case.
I think also we need to recognise that we're not starting from a blank sheet either. So I think when we want to measure, it's a shame sometimes that, and it happens hugely in my area of health and care, that we only ever insist on measuring when we want to put something new in. And we very rarely take a measurement of what's the baseline beforehand. And I imagine the baseline before offshore renewable energy is probably, continuing that status quo is probably worse for biodiversity than putting in offshore renewable, and then, as Margarita says, working with the teams to try and make sure mitigate the piece. I think, others have put questions similar to this in the chat. I think sometimes we utilize the fact that complexity makes us go, oh, we can't decide yet. And I think is it Tony Robbins that talks about complexity being the enemy of execution? And sometimes we just go, well, it's complex, therefore let's just keep the status quo. And actually, if we are going to honor those decisions about let's understand, let's commit and act, we can't spend all of the time trying to get the perfect understanding, because then we'll never have time to commit and never have time to act. And so for me, it is about getting that status quo. And Jayne mentioned a great example about land use. That's one thing where we need to get a status quo of how is the land currently used, so that we can then have the discussion about how we want to use it. In England, back in 2011, Royal Town Planners Institute suggested a way to do that, so that you could model all of the different policy decisions about where houses would go, where trains would go, where roads would go. They built the map. It was ready to be published, and we're still waiting for a government to go, yes, that sounds like a good idea. Let's have a consensus view of where all of these plans are, so that we're not building houses on the same place where someone says that's where our train station is going to go and that's where our school's going to go. But at the moment, we don't have consensus that we need that baseline. And for me, that's what makes it very difficult to then say, how do you measure an improvement or a mitigation or a biodiversity loss if you don't know what your starting position is or your status quo?
Excellent. Right. Shall we move on to some questions in the chat then? This one from Steyen van der Schuren. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. What role or importance do you see for biodiversity inside our buildings, but also extreme urbanized environments where air pollution is very high and green spaces do not mitigate all negative impacts? So inside the building and also those urbanized environments with high air pollution. Who wants to take that one? Don't all rush at once.
I'm happy to
start. There you go,
helps.
John. There you go.
So in a previous life, we did quite a few projects around air quality, both ambient and indoor. And globally, it is the case that the indoor air quality tends to have a larger impact on fatalities and long-term conditions. And typically, that indoor air quality is as a result of the energy that's being used for cooking and heating the property, rather than the materials of the property itself. So for me, it's about how do we make sure that what we're constructing and what we're supporting globally are, as Margarita said, not just a bare minimum of standards, but actually, what should be exemplified as this is good policy of how to heat your home, how to provide energy to cook and to stay healthy. And that some of that there is a responsibility in the construction industry, but certainly not exclusively. And so for me, air quality is a really important topic, and the fact that the UK and other places, they are starting to recognise that it is causing deaths, hopefully means that people will have those conversations. And it comes down to spatial conversations, so collectively buses are better for a town than cars in regards to air quality, but standing at a bus stop is one of the worst things that you can do for your exposure to air quality, because it's normally where cars are idling, it's normally where buses idle. Same with train stations. Train stations are notoriously bad for air quality at a personal level, but collectively, societally, train stations are very good for air quality. So we need to have that spatial understanding to have those conversations about. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have train stations or we shouldn't have buses, but how do we mitigate the fact that bus stations are bad for air quality? How do we, I think one of the other conversations in the chat is about, how do we encourage families to adopt some of this? And how do we, for me, these topics are about how do we not necessarily rewrite curriculum, but make sure that the curriculum that, children are learning has an air quality or a biodiversity angle to it. So we did a project looking at maths and science, because we were a STEM company, and said, at certain ages where typically health and physical education drops off, this is what's in the maths curriculum. Why not learn those graphs in relation to the air quality in their local area? And then they can have that conversation. They're still learning the curriculum. It's not putting undue pressure on teachers to teach another topic. They're still learning about bar graphs and histograms and various other bits, but they're saying, actually, we've got a problem in our local area with air quality. Are you going to walk to school? And are we going to put on something that helps you to walk to school? Or are we going to encourage your parents not to idle by the school and to turn off your car engine when you're being dropped off? And for me, it's those types of small examples that feel a bit more manageable than saying we need to drop science or maths from the curriculum and suddenly do biodiversity studies. I think it's how do we embed it more in everyday life, and that's why people like Jayne and the team at Earth Trust it's great examples of that, where it's on the doorstep and it's about engaging in the day-to-day rather than let's rewrite society.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it was Emma Nicholson who asked the question about how we support biodiversity in our homes and further educate families, and also bring the knowledge and education into primary and secondary schools. And it always seems to me, from a layperson's point of view, that we, when we need to, and when we feel the danger personally, we can educate ourselves very quick. I mean, everybody in this room is an expert on COVID because we educated ourselves very, very fast, and perhaps we need to do the same thing with climate change, with biodiversity, and recognize the danger to our personal welfare and our families and wider society, of course. Has anybody else got anything to add on that sort of education piece on how we can get the messages out there?
Yes, can I just go back to the plants in people's homes and connect that through? So there's passive education, isn't there, and there's active education, and we know that gardening and outdoor gardening and indoor gardening is a real way into people's lives and into their connection with the environment, and learning about how to grow something and how something thrives and what you do in order to encourage it to thrive, and what sometimes you do to do the reverse, actually helps people's understanding of nature and the natural world and their connection with it. And we learned during COVID that when people couldn't get out, it was those house plants and growing things indoors that really kept them going. So my point here is that although the question might seem flippant in terms of growing houseplants, actually that is a real way into people's lives, and as a result of that connection, they're more likely to want to understand more. I think that there is a different approach when we come to, a slightly different approach when we come to formal education. The major challenge there is around the curriculum and how we can embed environmental studies, the breadth of environmental studies within the curriculum. There are places to get into the curriculum through the primary schools. It's far more difficult in secondary education, yet that is where the majority of young people they have their concerns.
I think if I can just give a very quick shout out, the Natural History Museum is actually doing a lot of outreach work, specifically working with schools across the country on this topic, which is really inspiring. So if anyone's interested in finding out more, I would encourage you to look up Urban Nature Network and Natural History Museum. I was recently speaking to the team there and was really blown away by the work they're doing.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Finton has asked a question in the chat. At some point in time, environmental issues were divided into two camps: biodiversity concerns and climate concerns. This needs to be addressed and the two brought back together to ensure that one perceived benefit does not impact on the other. Both need to improve in tandem. This is the essence of BNG. Who wants to pick up on that one?
I'd absolutely agree with that. We've got, I think there's also, I've seen a really good diagram that some people posted of environmental tunnel vision, where somebody's looking at a circle and all around the edge are all the different environmental issues that we should be thinking about, including biodiversity loss and everything, and all the different aspects of the challenges of climate change. And there's just a single line that they're looking at the word carbon. And even within climate change, there's this fantasy that if we somehow get carbon management right, it'll all be okay. And it simply won't, because climate change is happening. So we've got to adapt to it. Absolutely, this is all linked. There's also the human health thing. There's something about holistic thinking and joining it up to say, this all matters. We're not going to solve one thing and not worry about the others. But it's also, it can be daunting, that complexity. And I do worry about the fact that if we rattle off this incredibly long list, then people just go, really? And you start to fall back to the default position of, maybe I won't do anything, because what if I go and buy a beehive and think I'm doing great things for pollinators, and then actually I find that putting domestic bees out there is harming native pollinators. So I think having the information on the issues, but also information on the safe initiatives, the things that will do some good and won't do harm. So where can we do, like, go peat free? I would challenge anybody to say, stopping having peat in your garden, what environmental harm would doing that cause? Because actually digging up peat, there's been calls to ban it in the UK for a long time because recognising the harm to wildlife of destroying peat bogs. But actually we now know peat bogs are incredible at capturing carbon. But even that, you think, well, that's simple. Let's just say nobody cuts peat ever again. There are communities where that is part of their very long-term way of life. So there's always got to be a bit of sensitivity. I've just seen there's a comment in there, someone just said we should be obsessing about soil microbes. Again, yes. So where the things that are safe wins, and it's then when you do a little bit of action, it gives you courage to do some more as well.
And Claire, just to bring it back to the construction industry, I think what you've highlighted is the need for all parts of the sector or sectors, but construction industry is a good example. My industry is a good example of that sort of multidisciplinary need that we have now. We need to recognise that we have to collaborate as different specialists in order to address all these sort of much more complex interconnected problems that we have to fix when we're building new assets or refurbishing them. Because you're absolutely right, we risk, like the wind farm in the sea example, we risk damaging one for the sake of the other. But if we can bring our disciplines together, then we'll have a much better chance of making progress across all fronts.
And a lot of this, I think, comes down to the evidence that is available and how that evidence is then translated into frameworks or ways to take actions. Because to Claire's point and points that have already been raised, this is complex, and each of these issues, sort of climate change, biodiversity loss, health, they're complex in their own sort of disciplines, let alone when you start looking at those links between them. But I think the more evidence you have, the more you're able to synthesize that evidence and come up with, simple, straightforward recommendations, policies, regulations, incentives, the more likely you are to achieve better outcomes. And again, that is something that's happening increasingly. I think to talk again about the Natural History Museum, just because I was so fascinated by the work they're doing, but they're undergoing this project right now to digitize all of the collections that they have. And I think they mentioned they have 80 million sort of individual samples, and I saw some of them, and you know, these are like flies from the 1920s that have been preserved. They're now digitizing all of this data, and once that data is digitized, they can do a lot of work around using sort of machine learning to do essentially predictive analytics. And you know, where was the sort of climate when we had this sort of biodiversity, these types of organisms, and a lot of this work, which, you know, once that evidence is available, then that hopefully feeds into the policy discussions and other discussions that can lead into then, well, what should the business community actually be doing? Because to Claire's point, like, it's not always clear.
I was at fortunate to have a similar tour around Kew Gardens, and they're doing an equivalent project, creating pictures of all of their plant records so that those can be available to people throughout the world at the touch of a button. But they showed us a sample of a plant that was collected by Charles Darwin, and they've been able to take DNA from it to help with identifying the links with other species. It is mind-blowing what the science would do. I think one thing I was thinking in terms of the simple messaging, kids love nature. You get them out in nature and they will engage with that, whatever their past experience, if you've got the right sort of communicator with them to make them feel welcome. One of the things that's sad is somehow we lose that. And I've loved it being in meetings with companies like house builders, where you give the message, looking after nature is sound business sense. And actually you find there'll be people around the table who feed the birds in their garden and are suddenly going, hang on, so I'm allowed to care about nature in my job. And there's that light bulb moment for people to think nature is good business sense, suddenly is quite freeing. And it can turn the conversation around.
Excellent. I have a question for Roberta, which may seem like a bit of a flippant question, perhaps, but from a media point of view, I mean, I've worked in various forms of media, radio predominantly. The way that we talk about weather and climate, I mean, it seems to me that sometimes the media get it so wrong, and that doesn't help with the overall messaging, the overall education piece. You know, we'll get those scorching hot summer's days, and you'll hear people on the radio, for example, talking about how fantastic it is. Do we need to be changing the messaging and not have those conversations? I mean, yeah, everyone likes a warm day, but when this is part of something very, very serious, do we as a society, but specifically for the media as well, need to be talking in slightly more muted terms, perhaps?
Sure, but this is you know, especially for England, probably this is not the same in the other part of the world, where, you know, when the temperature really is rising, is affecting the health and of many people, and heat waves are really killer. But I think I agree with you that there must be. We need to develop more a forecast or an impact-based conversation or messaging, where we can say, we don't say just, you know, tomorrow is this temperature, but is, you know, like what is for you, what is for this region, what are the impacts of this temperature, and it's very difficult to do that, because you need to, you know, if you think about the climate risks, you have you know, the hazards, and then we can predict. Our work in WMO is to predict those hazards or those extreme events. But then there is also all work that we need to do on vulnerabilities and exposure. So we need, and I go back also to what was, you know, asked before. We need to build more and more on exchange data and integrate data, because we will learn a lot from how you know, all these biodiversity loss, climate change, and other factors are influencing, are impacting our lives. And the conversation has to be what is the impact rather than what is the situation, you know. I think we are slowly moving towards that, but we need to improve much more our communication, our messaging strategies. I agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. I know you need to leave us, so that may be the last time we hear from you today. So I want to say thank you before you leave us in case we overrun. But thank you so much for your contribution. Lots of chat still coming in, Claire, in the chat there. People coming up with all kinds of different ideas that we should treat the whole interconnect as part of the family. Talked about the planet as part of our family. Talk about the planet as our customer. You know, these are useful ways to start thinking, aren't they?
Things, yes. I've also seen some comments on the internet about companies saying we're going to give the planet a seat on our company board. Quite what that looks like, I'm not sure, but it's a really cool concept, and I think it helps focus the mind. And also, this is something actually investors are asking. They're challenging companies. You know, we want to see the evidence. We want to see not just an ESG report. That's great, but give us the detail, reassure us that there's robustness behind it, that you do know what's going on in your company.
Do you think the ESG, and I maybe invite Margarita to comment on this as well, that the ESG, you know, those three elements that make up ESG is too broad for one person who sits on a board to be responsible for all of those, given that there are so many topics that fall under ESG, and actually that maybe at this stage, certainly with the big companies, they need somebody on the board who is the environmental champion or who is the director of, you know, of climate mitigation or whatever it may be.
Yes, I'll give a very quick response because unfortunately I also need to run. But I mean, the quick answer is yes, it is too broad for one person. Generally speaking, it's not just one person. The entire board is supposed to be thinking about ESG, and obviously the board exists because of the G, the governance of a company, and you know the board's kind of one of the main ways in which that governance is implemented. I do think it is something that's increasingly recognized, and one of the great things about COP15 and the framework that now exists is that it has shot up to the top of the agenda for a number of large companies that, you know, have been grappling with sort of carbon and you know, the great thing about carbon, for all I fully agree it's not perfect, is that it is relatively simple and straightforward. You know, it's this one thing that you need to measure and reduce and, you know, to a certain extent offset, although that's a whole other sort of topic. But I think, you know, that's the good thing, that now increasingly people and companies are asking about biodiversity, and you know, where do we start? That tends to be sort of the question. And you know, there are companies and solutions and resources out there to grapple with, but you know, definitely it is something that I think management teams, but also the boards of companies need to continuously evolve on. And you know, there should be a greater focus. There should also, I think, in my view, be a greater focus on what does the E and the S actually mean? Because the two things that most companies have focused on are, you know, diversity and inclusion, and specifically gender, because that's the easiest, most obvious one to try and sort of fix and have quotas on, and carbon, because they're very, you know, they're very sort of specific. I think it is really time to kind of increase that or broaden that agenda out and try and have, you know, a greater, more ambitious sort of priority list, which includes biodiversity and nature.
Fantastic. Margarita, thank you very much for your contribution. In fact, thanks to all of our panel. Claire, obviously a lot of people needing to move on and do other things this afternoon. So I will hand over to you for some final comments.
Just want to end with a massive thank you to everybody. It's been great. Everyone on the panel, you've contributed so much, but also we can just see from the rapid fire of comments with people interacting with each other in the chat and thoughts sparking there. It's great to have this sharing of knowledge. One thing I'm conscious of is people have joined this call. It already shows that people care and people understand that there's an issue. So I think there's it's great to have someone like Constructive Voices getting the message out to share with people who may be in your audience who aren't thinking environmentally. So raising awareness for the people who haven't yet embedded it in their thinking. But yes, this is a conversation that needs to continue, and it's great to have had the time today to do these reflections. The timing couldn't be better, coming after COP15 in the UK. We've had the government announcements today. There's momentum that we need to be part of, but also then hold governments to account and say, let's see those promises. How do we all work together to make them real? I think the point several people have made about there's so much to do. We've got to be working together. We've got to be working at all scales. Yeah, thank you everybody for your time this afternoon.
Can I
John,
ask a question? I guess maybe just for Steve and Pete and team to continue the conversation beyond this episode. So Margarita touched on, you know, the importance of evidence and how does that implement changes, or how do people make different choices because evidence grows and we learn things? I guess one of the things I'd want you guys to have a think about, and construction generally, is if you are, you know, as Pete was describing earlier, more hands-on at the actual building end and you're a smaller entity, how often would you want to be, you know, have a job on your 6 month, you know, work schedule that says, actually, we're going to pay you to learn how to use this new way of building or this new material? It can't come that you know you can fit that in and do that work for free. So how do you have that added into your schedule so that we don't just reserve ESG or ESHG, if you're going to include health, as just something that big companies do, and then everyone else just gets told what to do? It'd be good for you guys to have a think about, you know, within construction, where does that fit in, and how do we make sure that you guys have the space to actually work with some of this new material or work in the new ways that are being, I was going to say constructed, but that's a bad choice of words. But yeah, how are you part of that conversation? And I think Jayne put it in the chat earlier about we can try and bring different disciplines together, but that normally means those that have got the free time to do it. And how do we make sure that actually, you know, the guys that are actually doing the acting more often than not are the smaller firms, or the those that are just getting on with doing the building. They've always done it in a particular way because they don't have the headspace or the opportunity to learn new materials and try things out and fail. And that, for me, you know, Claire's point about the bees is part of that, of actually it's okay to get it wrong. But it feels like in construction we don't allow lots of the smaller companies that freedom that in lots of other sectors we do allow people to learn and fail and use the wrong material or do the wrong thing. I'd love to hear more from, you know, from your next set of podcasts to look at what would be needed from your sector and how can we in other sectors support you to do that.
Thanks very much, John. I love the way you're throwing a couple of questions back at me and Steve, which is great as well. But no, it's brilliant that we've had such different point of views, all with the same collective goal here today. And without the shadow of a doubt, it's literally why Constructive Voices has been set up, and what we want to do is to continue the conversation, and we want to look at it from everybody's perspective and see, can we learn from each other, and can we put systems in place to try and improve all aspects of construction, whether it's a commercial, domestic, large and small scale. And I absolutely agree with everything you said there. I don't think until we make it mainstream, I used that word earlier as well, and I really do believe that it has to be mainstream. You're dead right. People, they have to be able to give them the time, but they also have to be able to give them economic opportunity to do this. Because if you're asking a builder of any scale to commit a certain amount of time to do something, that means money, and that means, you know, and unless that's going to have a benefit for him economically, or the entity economically, or she economically, it's not going to be viable, and therefore it gets overlooked and it gets put on the long finger. So I think it was brilliant. Thank you very much to everybody who came on today. It was fantastic. Well done to Jackie, Steve, Claire, all our panelists, and everyone else that listened in as well. It was fantastic to hear everyone's perspectives, and believe me, this will not be our last round table. I'm looking at this subject from a lot of different perspectives and other subjects going forward as well. So thank you very much, everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pete, and thanks to everybody. Claire, final word to you.
Thank you all again. It's been a great afternoon. Lots to think about, lots to take forward.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder, constructive-voices.com is our website. We're on social media. The podcast is available pretty much everywhere you can get podcasts. And we'll be back with lots more events, lots more things during 2023. So please continue to join us for these, because the conversation is building. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll be back very, very soon. Have a good afternoon.